Welcome to Bharati 100, a podcast dedicated to exploring the life and legacy of Indian national poet C. Subramania Bharati, 100 years after his death. This is Meera T. Sundararajan, Bharati's great-granddaughter. I've entitled this episode, The Jewel in the Crown. Of course, this was an expression often used to refer to India under the British colonial rule. It was the jewel in the British crown. India was that jewel. Here in the West, there have been a number of explorations of the period of British rule in India, particularly the latter period, which is often portrayed in films and programs. Of course, there's the very famous miniseries by the name The Jewel in the Crown from the mid-1980s, which in a way inaugurated this genre. But it's portrayed as a period of great romanticism in many ways. The lifestyle enjoyed by the imperialists in India, the afternoon teas against grand settings in places like Darjeeling, and generally this feeling of decay, which is definitely acknowledged, but also a sort of nostalgia of empire. And having lived in the UK for a number of years, I must say I've heard these discussions come up from time to time about Britain's glorious past and the romantic days of empire. Well, this podcast is intended to offer a different perspective on the idea of the jewel in the crown. You might say it's presented from the jewel's perspective, because how all of this looked to the Indian community that was being governed and the experience that they were having as a result was very, very different. It seems to me that that perspective hasn't really found its way so much into the Western media, and to the extent that it hasn't really found a foothold or become part of the popular imagination in the same way the nostalgic looks at empire have. Over the past year or so, as Bharati's 100th death anniversary was approaching, I spent quite a bit of time reading through his English writings. It was one of the great privileges that I had during the past year to really immerse myself in his work in that way. But I must say, the first essay in the book, called The Political Evolution in the Madras Presidency, it's also the longest piece in the book, but it was by far the most difficult thing that I read or worked on during the entire year. In fact, I'd say that almost uniquely out of the items in the book, reading this one and becoming familiar with it was not a very pleasant experience for me. In fact, it is a first-hand narration of the experience of British colonial rule in South India, and it's a shocking narrative. Even for someone like myself, a person of Indian origin, being born into the Bharati family and knowing very well that freedom fighters sacrificed a great deal in the context of that struggle, it was still shocking for me to read this essay. The character of the government that he describes is so cruel, so barbaric, and ready to employ violence against virtually anyone to maintain its authority. At the same time, and this is a particular facet of its cruelty, it's an administration that is steeped in hypocrisy. And I think that this was actually most shocking of all to me as a person today who associates Great Britain with a long tradition of freedom of speech and respect for human rights. This was a very different picture of British values that emerged from Bharati's writing. And one of the challenges that he actually puts forward is this very hypocrisy. He's not surprisingly deeply troubled by that. And he says, the British speak with such passion about freedom of speech, and yet it's repressed in our country in a way that seems to be unique in the world. There is an essay that appears a little bit later in the book called Police Rule in India, and in that one, Bharati writes, I wish I had sufficient power of language to depict the whole absurdity and injustice of the thing. I have heard and read about many countries, and I may record my sincere conviction that nowhere in the world is the sacredness of individual liberty more cynically ignored than in Madras and certain other provinces of India. My heart really breaks in this essay because it's impossible to me to understand how a poet like Bharati, who had such linguistic fluency at his fingertips, is driven to the point where he actually says, I can't express this. I don't have the power of language to express the gravity of what's happening. It's simply impossible to understand. Going back to the long essay on the political evolution in the Madras Presidency, what Bharati is actually talking about here is the process by which British rule in South India in particular goes sour. And he talks about a situation where a slowly stirring sentiment of nationalism is expressed in a series of isolated incidents to which the British have a violent reaction. That reaction essentially creates a number of ripple effects in the society at large. So I'd like to read directly from Bharati here to shed a bit more light on the whole situation. As things took a turn for the worse, Bharati writes, the Britishers in India were so far from identifying with the Indian people that they could most easily be led to believe in any of the most impossible misrepresentations made against the latter by hireling informers and worse folk. For the moment, the minds of the British rulers in India were possessed by a strange and hypnotic fear expressed in the vague terms, the incomprehensible East. From fear to severity is hardly a step. Soon, the government started a policy of repression and terror in almost every province in India. Nationalist speakers and nationalist journals were prosecuted and subjected to severe punishment everywhere, even in benighted Madras. Of course, if the British officials in India felt that there was absolutely no chance of their getting unified with the Indian people, if, voluntarily or otherwise, they felt that the gulf of misunderstanding between the two races was unbridgeable, and if, in addition to this, they apprehended at any time that these Indians, constituting a tremendous majority of 320 million human beings, were in serious danger of being infected by the seditious cult of bomb-throwing, then indeed we can see that there would be hardly any chance of sound and conciliatory statesmanship being displayed by these officials. And the result was that they resolved upon the grim and fateful policy of ruthless repression. The strong ties of goodwill that had grown between the Indian and British communities during generations of considerate policy suddenly snapped to pieces. To India, that stood expectant of gracious reforms and concessions at the hands of the British, the Anglo-Indian representatives of the British nation offered the bitter rod of punishment. How wise it would have been on the part of the British authorities at that period if they had adopted a policy of clear-sightedness, of justice and of humanity. Had they but punished the actual perpetrators of crime and then left things alone, the subsequent history of India would have run on lines much more favorable to the British. But fate had ordained otherwise. And forth goes the fiat: repress, imprison, deport, hang. The immediate result, of course, was what alone could be expected. The people were dumbfounded by terror. Peace, of course, was established. Peace of a kind. But concord had gone. All sorts of instinctive and atavistic racial fears and animosities were brought to the surface. The petty and miserable attempts at a schoolboy's rebellion were crushed out utterly, but this insignificant result was reached at a tremendous cost. I find it fascinating how Bharati invokes fate here. It's a poetic idea that he uses to account for British conduct and then Indian reaction to that conduct. His underlying idea is the inevitability of freedom. When he concludes this long essay, Bharati writes, "The Indian mind was afire with new ideas and aspirations. A storm arose in the southern province, a great and wild storm of patriotism.